They were warriors of legend, fighters who bled beneath the sun while thousands screamed their names. In the arena, they were gods, muscles, steel, and spectacle, symbols of masculinity. But behind the sand and steel was something Rome didn't want you to see. These men weren't champions. They were slaves, bought, branded, and broken. And when the crowd went home, the real torment began. In palaces and private chambers, the same bodies that thrilled the public were taken behind closed doors, not for honor, not for war, but for pleasure. They were touched, used, and silenced, owned in every sense of the word. This is the part of Roman history you won't find in marble, the story buried beneath the blood and the cheering, a story of control, shame, and power. This is the secret life of the gladiator, not just a fighter, but a sex slave to an empire. They were Rome's stars. Warriors forged in sweat and steel, gladiators stood in the arena surrounded by thousands, the crowd shouting for blood, the emperor watching from above. But behind this spectacle was a grim truth. Most of these fighters were not heroes. They were slaves, owned by trainers, traded like livestock, forced to fight or die. The Colosseum wasn't just a battleground. It was a marketplace for flesh, violence, and control. Gladiators became symbols of masculinity and strength, but also of submission. Some were criminals, others captured from faraway lands. Once inside the ludus, the training school, everything changed. Names were stripped, bodies were broken. They belonged to someone else now. Yet even as they bled in front of roaring crowds, a deeper pain lingered, one that didn't come from swords or wounds, because some gladiators weren't just chosen to fight, they were chosen to serve. Behind the scenes, they were owned in every sense, their strength admired, their bodies taken, their silence demanded. This is the story history tried to bury, the part of Rome's legacy rarely told. Not all wounds came from the arena. Some came from what happened after the crowd went home. In ancient Rome, gladiators were not soldiers. They were slaves. Their bodies were bought and sold, like cattle. The men who trained them, called lanistas, controlled every aspect of their lives, from what they ate to when they would die. A gladiator had no rights, no voice, no freedom. If he was strong, he was an asset. If he was beautiful, he was used for more than just fighting. Attractive young fighters were often pulled aside for private entertainment, chosen not for skill, but for looks. In the eyes of the elite, a gladiator was property, and property could be touched, ordered, used. The law didn't protect them. Roman slaves were legally non-persons. What happened to them behind closed doors was not a crime. It was expected. Imagine surviving brutal training each day, only to be summoned by someone who owned your body that night. The arena broke bones, but the palace broke something deeper. This was not about sex, it was about power, about reminding the gladiator that no part of him truly belonged to himself. In Rome, even the strongest men could be stripped of dignity, and no sword could stop that. In public, gladiators were heroes. In private, they were fantasies. Roman women were known to become obsessed with them. Some sneaked into training schools at night, others bribed guards just to spend an hour with their favorite fighter. They believed a gladiator's sweat had magical power. Some even collected it in bottles to wear as perfume. But this obsession wasn't romantic. It was ownership masked as desire. And it wasn't just women. Wealthy Roman men also used gladiators. At banquets, fighters were paraded like animals, admired, touched, sometimes taken away once the guests had left. The gladiator had no choice. His silence wasn't consent, it was survival. Writers of the time hinted at this abuse. Juvenal mocked elite women for chasing after them. Petronius described gladiators as ornaments at noble feasts. They were not people. They were pleasure tools, strong, silent, and obedient. Rome loved power, but it loved showing power even more. And nothing showed power like bending a warrior's will. Some gladiators gained fame. Crowds screamed their names. Artists carved their likeness in stone. But behind the glory was a man with no control over his own life. He might win in the arena and still be called to serve a nobleman's household that night. Fame gave no freedom. It just made the cage look prettier. The strongest gladiators were often the most abused because they were the most wanted. And when they refused, they were punished, beaten, or replaced. Imagine being praised during the day and degraded by night. Some broke, some fought back, some simply gave up. There are records of gladiators ending their lives, not in combat, but in quiet moments. Away from the roar of the crowd, they chose death over submission. Because no matter how loud the cheers were, they couldn't drown out the silence of shame. Their suffering wasn't carved into statues, but it was real, and it left scars no sword could match. Rome liked to display power, not guilt, but a few voices in history dared to reveal the truth. The poet Juvenal mocked noble women who slept with gladiators. He didn't blame the fighters, he blamed a society that turned warriors into toys. Suetonius wrote about emperors like Commodus, who surrounded themselves with gladiators for reasons that went far beyond sport. Seneca, the philosopher, warned of a Rome that fed off cruelty, saying that gladiators were consumed by violence and pleasure. These weren't rumors. They were observations, quietly passed down. Historians didn't focus on them, but they're there, in footnotes, in satire, in whispered stories. And they tell us something Rome wanted to hide, that its bravest men were sometimes its most abused. The empire admired strength, but only when it could own it. That's why these truths were buried, because they didn't fit the legend. But real history isn't made of statues. It's made of what we're brave enough to say out loud. To many gladiators, death was not a fear, it was a way out. In the arena, they had a blade, they had purpose, they had a moment of control. But off the battlefield, they were powerless. Some gladiators stopped trying to survive. They stepped into the arena hoping to fall. Some refused to fight back. Others took their own lives in secret. It wasn't weakness, it was the only freedom they had left. We think of gladiators as fearless, but the truth is more painful. They were trapped, used, and discarded. A dying gladiator might be cheered by thousands, but no one would hear his final thought. Now they can't touch me again. To the crowd, it was entertainment. To him, it was escape. That is the tragedy Rome never engraved in stone. Today, we remember gladiators as icons. They are carved into our culture, symbols of raw power, defiance, and survival. We cheer for them in blockbuster movies. We wear their image on t-shirts. We name football teams after them. We build video games around the myth of the lone fighter, muscles shining, sword in hand, blood on the sand. But the gladiator we celebrate is only half real. The other half, the part that bleeds without glory, that was touched without consent, that was sold, used, and silenced, is erased. And Rome made sure of that. The Roman Empire was a master of image. It knew how to preserve what it wanted remembered: triumphs, temples, emperors, and military victories. It raised statues to generals. It carved honor into stone. But for the gladiators, especially those who were exploited behind closed doors, those who died without names, there were no monuments, no columns, no busts, no plaques. They were stripped of dignity in life, and then again in history. What we're left with is a carefully edited myth, one where the pain is cut out, where masculinity is celebrated but the exploitation that built it is conveniently ignored. We glorify their courage but not their captivity. We quote their strength but not their suffering. We show the swords and shields but never the chains. Why? Because it's easier to remember strength than submission. Easier to tell stories of battle than stories of abuse. Easier to look at a gladiator and see a hero than to look closer and see a victim. But history isn't supposed to be easy. It's not supposed to make us feel good. It's supposed to tell the truth. And the truth is this: many gladiators were never free men. They were forced to fight, forced to please, forced to smile through pain for the sake of the empire's image. Their bodies were entertainment, their silence was currency, and their death was often the only form of escape. Modern pop culture has turned them into fantasy figures, strong, fearless, unbreakable. But real gladiators broke. They cried. They were violated. They were forgotten. And we forget them all over again every time we reduce them to action scenes and slow-motion kills. What about the gladiator who died in a palace chamber instead of an arena? The one who was paraded at a banquet instead of a battlefield? What about the ones who were never allowed to say no? Their stories weren't carved into marble. They were whispered in satire, buried in letters, hinted at in poems. The historian Juvenal mocked elite Roman women for lusting after them. Suetonius spoke of emperors who surrounded themselves with gladiators for more than just sport. Seneca warned of a Rome that fed on cruelty until nothing was left but blood and shame. But most chose not to listen, and we still don't. The gladiator's legacy is not just about the roar of the crowd, it's about the silence that followed, the nights no one talks about, the cries history chose not to echo. So the question remains, do we honor these men by repeating the myth, by showing only the glory and none of the pain? Or do we finally face the full truth? Because the most powerful thing we can give them now is remembrance. Not the kind that sells tickets, not the kind sculpted in perfect marble, but the kind that acknowledges what they endured, the kind that sees them as more than warriors, the kind that calls them human. They lived in chains. Let us not chain their story too. If this story opened your eyes, don't let